Back and thank you for staying with us. Now, the U.S. wants to monitor Russia's activities here in Africa. A proposed new law will give Congress the power to track military operations, investment and financial flows. The Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act aims to hold African government to account. Let's discuss the impact on South Africa with Wits research fellow William Mpofu, who joins us now virtually. Mr. Mpofu, thank you very much for your time here on All Angles. Firstly, a reaction to the U.S.'s plans to pass this law?
It is a development that is not surprising, but that should be worrisome to Africans and all those that care about sovereignty and independence of the continent and its countries. It's a return to Cold War geopolitical climates where African countries are reduced to spheres of influence, and where the struggles amongst and between superpowers tend to play out in the continent, and where the continent and its countries are reduced to objects and not subjects of history. It's an alarming development, an unmasking of the working of empires and their continued interference and influence and activities in the African continent. It's coloniality at play, if one can put it in those terms.
And Mr. Mpofu, isn't it also an indication that the U.S. feels it's losing its influence in the African continent?
It's definitely that. Geopolitical analysts like Kishore Mahuban and others have observed that there is a shift in the grip of empires in the continent, and there is a fear that the U.S. have of the growth of China, Russia, and other BRICS concerns in the continent. So it's definitely a development that shows that there is a fear, there is concern, and there is alarm in the Euro-American empire concerning what is happening in the African continent. But the important thing to observe is how Africa itself continues to lose its independence, its sovereignty, and its freedom to associate who it wants to associate with and to work with who it wants to work with in the world interstate system.
Exactly, and I guess this also was influenced by the fact that when the UN was voting about sanctions on Russia because of its conflict with Ukraine, most African countries decided to abstain, like South Africa, for instance. But tell me, will the US be allowed to do this? I believe that 415 voted to agree that the law is passed, while about 9 voted against the law. So it looks like the law will eventually be passed. But will the U.S. have power to actually implement it on our continent?
It is the continent of Africa that must question, that must critique, and that must resist this development. I mean, this is coming back from 1955, the current and the motion of 9 alignment that African countries and other countries of the global south had to say we have the right and the power to non-align. I think politically speaking and ethically speaking, the U.S. has no right to determine who Africa works with and who Africa does not work with. And Russia has a whole history of supporting African liberation struggles for liberation against the Euro-Western colonialism. That relationship cannot be certainly severed by the United States of America in its geopolitical and even imperial and colonial interests. It is just not just.
And Mr. Mpofu, I mean, of course, as South Africa, we don't agree with the way that Russia is imposing whatever, conflict it has on Ukraine by killing innocent people, etc. But we do have a relationship with them in terms of BRICS. So if this law that the US is trying to pass does indeed go through, practically, how would they be able to, how would that affect us as South Africa and our BRICS relations with Russia?
Yeah, it's not even true that we do not agree. What is true is that we are open to evaluating what is happening, and we have a right to maintain neutrality. But as analysts and observers, we know that that war is also a result of a history of NATO versus Warsaw Pact and the continued enlargement of NATO into those former Soviet republics and so on. So the war has its history and has its causes, and it has been coming for a long time. But that should not lead to a situation where Africa is held under duress, compelled by any superpower or empire to align this side or align that side. Africa should be allowed to hold and enjoy its independence of analysis, observation, understanding, and action. So there is no power that can then use its colonial and imperial force and influence to compel Africa to vote in a certain direction and to work in a certain direction. I mean, it's a decolonial structure for Africa to insist on its neutrality, on its independence, and on its freedom. And South Africa, as we speak, is part of the BRICS economic arrangement. And that is a right that the country holds, and that parts of the continent and the continent holds. And there is no power under the sun that should take that right away from Africa or South Africa specifically.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Wits University Research Fellow William Mpofu. It's quite funny how the Western world never remembers us. I mean, even with regards to patency around the COVID-19 vaccine, they would not give that to us. But every time they need something, suddenly there are laws that they want to pass to force us to do things as the African continent.